the end, we'll allow for questions at the end in the chat box. Okay, so I hope you enjoy it, and thanks a million, Darren.
Great stuff. Thanks a million, Arlene, and thanks again to you and Deborah for inviting me to talk here tonight. And thanks to all of you for showing up this evening. So as Arlene said, I am just going to talk this evening a little bit about John Charlesworth, who is buried down in the graveyard in Killaloe beside the Cathedral, and has been there now for 105 years, almost to the day he died on May the 16th, 1916. So I'm going to chat a little bit about him. He's a very short but interesting life, and I have a good few images and maps and stuff like that. As Arlene said, I wrote an article about him a couple of years ago now, and some of you may already have read it, but hopefully this will have a bit more detail this evening and go into a little bit in depth more into his life. So just to briefly introduce myself, Darren O'Connell is my name. I'm not actually from Killaloe. I'm a blow-in from further down the river in Shannon town, but I'm living here for about 8 years or so now at this stage. And I teach history and German in Borskane Community College in Tipperary. So how I came across the story of John was basically because of a strange obsession, I suppose some might say, with graveyards and hunting around and snooping around graveyards. The older and more ruined and ivy covered the graveyard, I think the more I like it. And I think they're fascinating places. You can find out lots of great stories in all graveyards, and especially nowadays, of course, with all the information that's online in terms of census and death records and birth records and marriage records and so on. You can literally go into a graveyard, and if something catches your eye, like why did that person die so young, or why did all those family members die so close together, or whatever, you can there and then actually look it up and find loads of information about them on the phone. I was actually telling my students about my strange hobby today, and they thought I was a complete weirdo. But my own kids actually quite enjoy it, because anytime I've brought them into graveyards, they have come across some, just bear with me a second now. This doesn't seem to be moving on. Is there something going on, Arlene, there with the PowerPoint? No, I can't seem to share it.
I don't know, sorry. Yeah, I don't know what's. Yeah, is it working now?
No.
Oh no.
Is it paused or something? No?
Don't think so.
Okay, I'll try this again. Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. I don't know what happened there.
Perfect. Sorry.
So my own kids have come across these skull and crossbones, and they think that they are pirates' graves. So they love to come along when I tell them we're going looking for dead pirates. They're quite happy to join me in the graveyards. These are two local examples, actually. On the left-hand side there, this one is from skull and crossbones from a grave over in Ballina, Temple Kelly, in the old graveyard. And the one on the right is beautiful skull and crossbones in the Killaloe graveyard, Killaloe Cathedral. Also in the Killaloe Cathedral, of course, is this headstone here. And I suppose anyone who has seen it or been in there will probably agree that it stands out. It's a little bit unusual. It stands out a bit from the other graves. It's not your typical kind of cross or Celtic cross grave, and it's not one of those slab type graves. So it stands out a little bit from that point of view. And it also stands out and is unusual because it gives the cause of birth, or the cause of death, I should say, accidentally drowned in the Shannon. And that's quite unusual as well. You don't see that too often on headstones. So when I saw it, this is a good couple of years back now, the cause of death, obviously, the fact that he was in the Sherwood Foresters, and the date, the 16th of May, 1916, that got me thinking, of course, about the Easter Rising and wondering if there was some connection with the Easter Rising. So that's why I started to research John. And what I found out was the following. So John was born in Mansfield, which is a market town there in Nottinghamshire, between Sheffield and Nottingham. And he lives, I'm just getting my little pointer up here, and highlight this a little bit. So he lives early on in his life. He lives in the center of the town here in a place called Church Lane, and later on, then the family moved to the outskirts of the town into Broomhill Lane. So we have a record of him here on the census. Here he is living in Church Lane. This is the 1901 census, living with his father Ernest, who's 26 years of age, and he's a labourer. His mother Ellen. There's John himself. He is 2 years old. And he has a little sister called Dora, who is just newborn. She's only 1 month. There's also a boarder staying in the house with them on the night of the census. Fast forward then to 1911. And here again, we have them on the census, Ernest and Ellen, who seem to have been quite busy in the intervening 10 years. They've also added 4 more children to their family. We've got Ernest and Albert, 2 brothers of John's, and Florrie and Hilda. So they are 2 young children as well. And we can see John here is 12 years of age. He's going to school. Ernest is a farm labourer at this stage, and a carter. A carter basically was somebody who drove a horse-drawn cart. So the family is expanding at this stage, and John in 1911 is in school, as we can see from that census there. And sometime then between 1911 and 1914, John leaves school and starts working in this mine in Langworth Colliery, so a coal mine about 6 miles or so north of the town of Mansfield. And there's about 1,000 men and boys working in Langworth at that time. And it's not unusual, of course, for young boys to leave school and go to work in the mines. Working class boys didn't normally stay in education much longer than 12 or 13. And their future basically lay in either farming, mines, or going into the factories. So that was really all of the options that were open to them at that stage. In Langworth, we have lots of young boys working there. We also have evidence, unfortunately, of boys as young as 15 dying in accidents in Langworth. So it's quite a tough life for anyone from that area who ends up in the mines at such a young age. And you can see from the photograph here, it is quite a grim place. That's a black and white photo, but I think if you had a color version of that photo, it wouldn't look a whole lot different. You've just got the smokestacks. Everything is black and gray, and it must have been quite grim heading in there every day at such a young age, knowing that was probably your lot for life. So 1914, then, of course, everything changes. War breaks out in August of 1914. And, of course, young men all over Britain sign up in their droves. And we'll just go into a little bit of detail here about John's attestation form. So that's basically his form for signing up. So thousands of men and boys join the army. And they join up for various reasons. There are many reasons. Patriotism was one. The adventure of going to war, the glory of war. Peer pressure, of course, was a massive thing as well, and societal pressure. You had also this idea of the PALS battalions, where men were allowed to join up with their friends, maybe from their town or village or from their factory or soccer team or whatever, and they would be allowed to join up and stay and fight as a group. You also had the belief, of course, that the First World War was going to be a short war, that it was going to be over by Christmas and everybody would return as heroes. And all would be well. And of course, you can't underestimate the pull of war or the army for people who lived in these mining towns and going into work in places like Langworth Colliery. As I said, the misery and the drudgery of that for a young boy trying to get away from that was also a motivation for joining the army. So here we have John signs up. You can see here his name, John Charlesworth. From the parish of St. John's in Mansfield, and he is a miner. His trade or calling is a miner, and he gives his age as 18 years and 6 months. Now, if you've been doing the maths, you probably will have figured out that John is not being entirely truthful here about his age. In the census that we saw, he was 2 years old. That was in 1901, and in 1911 he was 12 years old. So by 1914, he can only be 15, or at the very most 16. Now, in the original article that I wrote, I said that he was 15 and I couldn't find any birth certificate for him. And that kind of bugged me for a while. So I went searching again, basically, and still couldn't find anything for John Charlesworth. And then I noticed that his parents, Ernest and Ellen, only married in 1900. That would have been after John was born. So it seems as if John was born out of wedlock, and normally children who were born out of wedlock, they would be registered under their mother's name. So when I did a search under John's mother's name, lo and behold, I came up with this, which is John's original birth cert. Now you can see that there's no name given for the father, no profession for the father, but his mother's name is there. Ellen Alice Eyre is her surname, and she works in a cotton factory in Mansfield. So that is his original birth certificate. So, and also proof that John's parents weren't married before he was born. And he has a very interesting date of birth as well. If you see on the left-hand side here, he was actually born on Christmas Day in 1898. So that would make him, if you do the maths, that would make him, where's my notes here again, 15 years and 10 months when he signed up to go to war. Okay, so very, very young. And you can see lower down here on the form that he signs up for the duration of the war. He is going to be a member of the Sherwood Foresters, which was kind of a nickname for the Notts and Derby regiment. And here we have his signature twice here below, the signature of the recruit, and him also taking the oath of allegiance to the king and to be loyal and faithful to the army and the king and so on. Yeah. So the age thing, I think, is something that I want to talk about for a minute, because it is, it's very important, I think, to John's story, but it's also something that's overlooked quite a lot in the general history of the First World War. So young men were signing up for lots and lots of reasons, as I said already. They reckon about 250,000 underage boys signed up to fight in the First World War. And it's kind of understandable when you look back at it. The boys were very, very keen and enthusiastic. Many of them were, at least. The government was desperate for troops to fight in this war. And recruitment officers were being paid for every man that they were able to sign up. And the recruitment officers often turned a blind eye in terms of age. If somebody looked fit, if they met the height requirement, and they looked like they could be made into a soldier, then the recruitment officers were very unlikely to ask for any proof of age. And if you could tell a convincing lie about your age and you looked the part, then it was easy enough to get in. There was very few questions asked. The most famous example, I suppose, of young soldiers in the First World War is this guy here on the left. His name is Sidney George Lewis. And Sidney joined up in 1915 at the age of 12 with the East Surrey Regiment. And he actually, amazingly enough, fought in the Battle of the Somme the following year. He was part of the machine gun corps there. So you've got the worst slaughter probably of the First World War and the Battle of the Somme. And there in the middle of it is Sidney George Lewis at the age of 13 as a machine gunner. So later on, his mother gets hold of his birth cert basically, and she demands that he is sent home, which he is. He's returned from the front, and he lives to tell the tale basically, and dies, I think, around 1969 or so. Less fortunate here on the right is this young man called Horace, and Horace's story goes as follows. He's from Leeds, or was, and he was on the tram one day, and he was quite big and tall and strong looking for his age. He was only 14, but a woman on the tram handed him a white feather, which of course is the symbol of cowardice, mistaking him for an adult. And that's one of the things I was talking about earlier on with societal pressure. There was a huge pressure on men to join the war. And if you were seen walking around town, people wondered, why aren't you off fighting in the front with all the other men? So Horace, having received this white feather, is kind of shamed into joining the war again at the age of 14. And his family are heartbroken, of course, to see him head off to war, and are constantly pleading with him to try and get himself home and so on. And I'm just going to play you a short little clip. This is a letter sent by his sister, Florrie. She sends a letter to him in 1916, basically begging him to come home to try and get himself out of war. So I'm just going to do this very short clip. You might have a listen, and hopefully you can hear this. Okay.
For goodness sake, Horace,
Okay, so hopefully you're able to hear that. I'm not sure what the audio quality was like, but basically she's pleading with him to come home. You've done your duty. You've nothing to be ashamed of. Tell them their age and they will send you home and so on. And unfortunately and tragically, the letter was too late. By the time she wrote it, Horace was already dead. He died on the 1st of July, the first day of the Battle of the Somme, at the age of 16. So really tragic stuff there. The letter was returned to Florrie unopened and marked killed in action at the front of it. So really, really sad story. And this whole thing, the whole topic of underage soldiers and stuff is covered very well by the BBC in a documentary. You can find it on YouTube if you're interested, called Teenage Tommies. It really is sad. And it seems shocking to us now, looking back 100 years later or so. And you know, you might think, oh, that was the way things were at the time and boys grew up quicker then and so on, and that's just the way it was. But actually at the time there was quite a lot of outrage about this age thing as well. There was an MP who was from Mansfield, actually, a guy called Arthur Markham, who kept bringing this issue up in Parliament and kept being ignored by the government. He was constantly asking about the age issue and why so many young boys were being sent away. The government, of course, denied that this was happening, but of course, it was plain for everybody to see. So Markham started a campaign where he got people, parents and families, to write into him, telling them their stories of their young boys who were fighting abroad. The rule or the law was that you had to be 18 to sign up and you had to be 19 to actually fight abroad. So that rule was being broken all over the country in thousands and thousands, as we said. But the campaign gathered a bit of momentum and eventually led to the government agreeing that any boy that could prove his age with his birth cert would be sent home from the front. The problem with that, of course, you heard Florrie actually talking about it in her letter there. The boys, anyone under 19 was being fetched back and brought back to England. The problem with it was, of course, that many of the boys didn't want to go home. Some of them had seen action, they were battle hardened, and they didn't want to leave their friends and their pals in the lurch in the trenches in France. Others who did come home were actually sent, or some of them were sent to holding camps until they were 18, until they reached the age limit, and they were then sent back to the front. So it was very, very difficult to get yourself out of the army once you were in it, regardless of your age. And the government considered, you know, you have signed a legal document, and of course, once bureaucracy takes hold like that, it's very difficult to roll it back. So to get back to John then, he, as I said, has told a big fat lie about his age. He's nowhere near 18 years and 6 months. But as I said, he's a tall lad. He's 5'4". The height requirement is only 5'3". 5'4" sounds quite small to us nowadays, but back then, of course, people were a good few inches smaller than they are nowadays, especially working class lads. Because of poverty and poor diet, they were quite a bit smaller than we are now. And also, something which highlights the class differences in England at the time, the officer classes were actually 2 to 3 inches, if not more, taller than the working class people. You can actually see it in old photographs where officers are standing beside the privates or the working class soldiers. They're a good bit taller than them. And again, that comes down to diet and poverty over many generations. And again, it highlights the class differences in England during this time. So John passes all the height restrictions. His chest size is good. His vision is good. An interesting thing here, you might notice actually apparent age. Okay, it doesn't say age, it says apparent age. And that, I suppose, is a clue again to the fact that a lot of people were maybe turning a blind eye to this age thing. Also here we see physical development good for his age. Another hint maybe that they knew maybe that this wasn't the fully grown man they were dealing with. But either way, he's considered fit by the medical officer, and he is signed off and becomes a member of the Sherwood Foresters at the age, as I said, of 15, what did I say? 15 years and 10 months, yeah. So it's interesting actually to speculate whether John told his parents that he was going to sign up for the war or not. Many young boys didn't. They went off with their boys, with their buddies to the recruitment station, and then came back with the devastating news to their parents that they had signed up for the war. And that happened all over the country, of course. coming back to heartbroken parents to find out that their sons had just signed up to go to war. Obviously, we don't know whether this was the case in John's case or not, but it's interesting to speculate. So John joins up with his buddies then in the 2nd 8th Battalion. So of the Sherwood Foresters, the 2nd battalions were reserve battalions. So the 1st 8th, for example, would have been fighting in France already. 2nd 8ths were backup battalions or reserve battalions. And the point of those, or the idea of reserve battalions, is that you fill in when the frontline soldiers are killed or wounded. The 2nd battalion fills in and they go abroad and take the place of those who are killed or wounded. So they, the 2nd battalion, 2nd 8th battalion spends the rest of 1914 and most of 1915 training, obviously going through their basic training, digging trenches, because that's what they had to prepare for if they did go abroad for fighting in trench warfare. And they were also held in readiness in case an invasion was launched by the Germans on the mainland. That never happened, of course. But all of these things were happening throughout 14 and 15, and they move around a bit. They move from Newark down towards Luton and Dunstable, and then eventually to Watford. From time to time, then you have drafts of the 2nd Battalion are drafted in to go to the front in the 1st Battalion and feed the front lines in France. And this was hugely frustrating for the officers who were training all these men to suddenly have them all taken away, and then new recruits would come in who would be completely raw, and you'd have to start from scratch all over again training these new guys. So that was frustrating for the officers, and that fact about the new recruits and the raw recruits would become quite important later on in the story. So these drafts are constantly heading out to the front, and one large draft of 80 men is taken away from the 2nd 8th in the middle of 1915. And I often wondered why John hadn't been drafted in at this stage, because he would have been one of the earlier ones into the battalion in the first place, but he never actually gets sent to the front line. So I was thinking maybe he wasn't up to the job as a soldier. Maybe they knew that he was quite young and left him off for that reason. But again, after doing a little bit of searching, I think I came up with the reason why he wasn't drafted in that particular draft during the summer. And it is this: in the summer of 1915, John goes to hospital with a hernia, and he spends 27 days in hospital. And he misses out that big draft of 80 men in the summer of 1915. So maybe, again, I'm only speculating, but maybe that's the reason why he was not drafted into the front lines. So in that hospital, which is here, the Eastern General Hospital in Cambridge, this is a huge hospital set up to cater for 1,700 men at the beginning of the war. It's on the banks of the river here beside the Cambridge colleges, on the cricket fields. And again, it's interesting to imagine, I suppose, what John would have seen and heard in this hospital. So you would have had fairly damaged and wounded men coming back from the war, some possibly maimed, many suffering from shell shock. And it would have been interesting, the kind of things that he would have heard and seen in his time there, in his month in that hospital. And I think around this time, middle of 1915, the general public are beginning to realize that this is not going to be a short war. It's going to be a long drawn out war, and they're beginning to hear the horrific stories that are coming back. So it must have been a real eye opener for John, spending that month in that hospital. But he returns. He's discharged after his operation and is put on furlough. I never actually knew what the word furlough meant until we all went into lockdown last year, and then the word became quite common. But furlough just means a leave of absence. So after his operation, he's given the chance to go home. Well, I presume he goes home to his family in Mansfield and takes time to recover and recuperate there. So he rejoins the battalion then in late 1915, and that brings us then to 1916 and the fateful year of 1916. So John returns to his battalion. Early 1916, the battalion, their training is starting to get more serious. Marches are getting longer. You have the top brass coming down to inspect them. You have some of their officers being sent over to the front lines in France to look at the trench warfare and the system and how the whole thing operated there. And all of this, of course, is pointing to the fact that these boys are going to be sent off to France in the very near future. One thing that they need to do before they go, though, is musketry training or rifle training. So many of the men would have trained with their rifles from day one, but they never actually get the chance to fire them in reality. So musketry training was a chance to go to like a special camp where they would all learn to fire their rifles and learn all about firearms and so on. But because of the backlog, because of the huge amount of soldiers that had signed up, there was a huge backlog and delay in training all these people in how to use their rifles. And the musketry training for John's battalion was penciled in for May the 1st. Okay, so again, this now is like the final preparation before these guys head off to the front lines in France. But something obviously intervenes to stop that from happening, and they never get to do their musketry training. And that is because on the 24th of April, Easter Monday, 1916, they receive orders to hold the battalion, to hold itself in readiness to move at once to an unknown destination. And of course, that destination is Dublin. And the Easter Rising has just kicked off. And we have 4 battalions of the Sherwood Foresters are sent across the water. So they get the train to Liverpool, first of all. Then they get on the boat and head to Dunleary, which was known as Kingstown, of course, at the time. And they arrive there on the Wednesday after Easter Monday. So that would be the 26th of April. So the Rising is in full swing at this stage. You have the rebels taking over the GPO and the forecourts and so on. You also have Boland's Mill out here on the south side of Dublin, led, of course, by Eamon de Valera. And he leads a battalion there. And in some of the houses and buildings around that area, we have rebels, small groups of rebels scattered around the place. And their job, the job of the guys stationed in this area was basically, let me get my little pointer thing up here again. Their job basically was to stop reinforcements from coming from across the water and up through, up from Kingstown, up through Ballsbridge and into Dublin City. So that was their specific job. That's what they were assigned to do. So the Sherwood Foresters then land 4 battalions of them, as we said, the 2-5, 2-6, 2-7 and 2-8 battalions land in Kingstown. And we've got some pretty raw recruits here. We've got a funny story about one soldier who greets one of the local ladies there by saying, "Bonjour, mademoiselle," assuming that he has been sent to France. We also, of course, have a lot of these guys who have never fired a rifle before. The commanding officer takes them down to, down to the seafront in Kingstown and gets them to fire out into the Irish Sea. That is the first time that some of them have used a rifle. So you've got pretty raw recruits here. And if you think this sounds like a recipe for disaster, then you'd be right. The battalions are split into 2 groups then. So the 2-5 and 2-6 are sent up through Dublin to approach Dublin from the west, up through Dolphin's Barn, and to go to the Royal Hospital in Kinmalem. And the 2-7 and 2-8 then are to march up through Ballsbridge and into Dublin from the south side and coming in towards Trinity College then, yeah. So that they are their orders. And we have a nice picture here of the Sherwood Foresters on that march on the way up to Blackrock. And they were pretty well received by the locals, by all accounts. The locals, of course, in South Dublin were pretty well-to-do, and many of them would have been Unionist and Protestant and sympathetic towards the British. So they're offered refreshments, they're offered maps, they're offered information about the Rising and where the rebels are holed up and all of that kind of stuff. And yeah, everything seems to be going quite well for them with these two battalions as they march towards Dublin. And we see then where they come up through what is Northumberland Road and on in towards Mount Street and across Mount Street Bridge, okay? So what happens here then is, turns out basically to be pretty much a disaster for the British, okay? So you've got a couple of rebels holed up in these buildings here. You've got 2 rebels here, Michael Malone and Seamus Grace in 25 Northumberland Road. You have 4 rebels here in St. Stephen's Parochial Hall, and you have 7 rebels holed up there in Clanwilliam House at the top of the street, okay? So in terms of numbers, you've got the 2 battalions of Sherwood Foresters numbering about 17 to 1800 men. Okay, so that's quite a lot of firepower, and you've only got a handful of rebels literally waiting for them on the street. But as they reach the corner here of Northumberland Road, Michael Malone and Seamus Grace basically start taking pot shots, and this becomes quickly a disaster for the British and easily the most successful engagement of the Rising from the point of view of the Irish rebels. So as we said already, the Sherwood Foresters were quite raw. Some of them have only fired a rifle for the first time that morning. They're also, they've been trained for trench warfare. That's what they've been trained to do. They are not equipped or trained for fighting in an urban environment or on a street. And they've also left 2 of their machine guns back on the docks in Liverpool for some reason. And their commanders only seem to know one way of attacking, and that's a full-on frontal charge. There doesn't seem to be any tactics or nuance to their strategies. They seem to like attack the building front on, and that leads to complete disaster. So from the 3rd floor building here, you can see a picture of this house. It's quite small, but this is a picture after the engagement with the British. So you can see the top 2 windows there are kind of burnt out. That's where Malone and Grace were firing from. And they basically start picking off the Foresters that are coming up here, up this road in their droves. And they had no cover, nowhere to take cover. They're completely exposed out on the road. And it becomes a bit of a bloodbath. One of the first guys to fall, and this is another sad story, is the guy called Captain Frederick Dietrichson. Sounds like a German name, but he's actually a British officer. And he's one of the first to fall in this engagement. And it's a pretty sad story, as I said. He was married to an Irish woman, and at the beginning of the war, he sent his wife and his young kids home to Ireland. Her mother lived in Blackrock, so she was staying with her mother in Blackrock and is there when the Sherwood Foresters come marching past on this Wednesday morning. And Dietrichson sees his wife and kids at the side of the road and breaks ranks. He breaks off from the column and goes over to hug them, of course, and embrace them and have a chat or whatever. And 2 hours later, he is dead on the street a couple of miles up the road on Northumberland Road. So that's quite a sad story as well. So like all of these things are full of these little individual stories of tragedy. Yeah. So Malone and Grace are firing away on the rebels, and as I said, it becomes a scene of pretty much slaughter for them there, because they're completely unprepared for what they've got themselves into. Eventually, though, they manage to take this building here. They get a couple of grenades and fire them into the house here, and Michael Malone is killed in the house. Seamus Grace manages to escape. He's eventually captured later on, but he escapes at that time. So they advance further up along the street here, and then they make another error in their strategy or their tactics. They try to attack this school here, St. Stephen's School, which I've marked in green here. Now, they had received information that rebels were in that building, and that information was true up till Tuesday evening when the rebels abandoned it. So they are targeting what is an empty building here on St. Stephen's School, and across the road, without them knowing about it, are 4 rebels in St. Stephen's Parochial Hall. So as they're making their way up the street to attack St. Stephen's School, they're getting hammered from the side here from St. Stephen's Parochial Hall, and also they've now become within range of the rebels here in Clanwilliam House. So we have another scene of awful carnage here around this area as they're trying to take the school. Now, it's hard to say really what John's place in all of this is. He is in the 2nd 8th Battalion, which is still behind the 2/7th. The 2/7th are the ones that are getting hit at this stage. The rebels in the parochial house eventually run out of ammo and they retreat. And the Foresters take over this school and eventually, of course, find out that it's empty and they have been dying and fighting over an empty building. So the last thing that they need to turn their attention then to is the rebels here in Clanwilliam House. And at this stage, it's the turn of the John's Battalion, the 8th Battalion, to come up and relieve the 7th and try to take this house. But again, if you look at the map here, you've got a really exposed area here on Mount Street Bridge. Very, very hard for the soldiers there to get cover, and they're being picked off by the rebels in this building here. But again, they wear them down eventually over time, and using bombs and grenades, they managed to take the house, kill the rebels inside, and the house eventually goes on fire. So, as I said, it's hard to know where John's part in this was. It's possible that he was engaged in the last part of this, the attack on Clan William House, because that was the C Company of the 8th Battalion who took that over, and he was part of the C Company, so we can assume that he was involved in some way in that. Now, the capture of Clan William House, it kind of marks the end of the Battle of Mount Street Bridge, and the aftermath is quite a terrible scene. You've got dead and wounded foresters all up along the streets here, littering the roads. The place is swimming in blood. You've smoke coming from all of these buildings here. So it must have been a huge shock to the locals to look out at their quiet neighborhood and find it all of a sudden a battle zone on this morning on Wednesday the 26th. So by the end of the day, the British have lost 160 casualties. So that's dead and wounded, 26 killed, 134 wounded. Now, the numbers obviously are tiny compared to the slaughter that was going on in France and on the front in the First World War, but it was still shocking. It was a massive shock to the British Army that they had taken such casualties when they were outnumbered by about 100 to 1. The rebels were outnumbered. So to inflict that kind of casualties on the British Army from a handful of rebels was a massive victory for the rebels and a disaster for the British. So all in all, about 4 rebels were killed that day. So they really punched above their weight in that particular battle. Some of the Sherwood Foresters were buried in Dublin. 2 here that I picked out. These guys are died on that day. You can see the date on their headstones there, 26th of April 16. Dixon and Sibley. That's in Grange Gorman Cemetery in Dublin. So the next day then on the Thursday, the John's Battalion, the 2-8, are involved in a couple of smaller skirmishes on their way to the Royal Hospital in Kinmalin, but nothing major really, because the rising is starting to peter out at this stage. We were a week into it. The Irish rebels are tired, they're running out of ammo. The British are starting to overwhelm them, and the whole thing is starting to fall apart basically. But the British are still unsure about what the state of the rest of the country is. They don't know if risings are planned or have taken place in the rest of the country. The information is quite sketchy at the time. So John's battalion are ordered to move to Athlone on the Friday morning of the Easter week. Yeah. The other Sherwood Foresters remain in Dublin. Many of them are involved in rounding up the rebels that started the rising. And some are actually invited to take part in the execution of the leaders of the rising in revenge for what happens or what happened at Mount Street Bridge. So that's why you may hear people talk disparagingly of the Sherwood Foresters, possibly because of their involvement in the execution of the leaders of the rising. But John's battalion had left Dublin at that stage, and they moved down towards Athlone. The reason they go to Athlone and from there to Athenry is because there has been a bit of a rising there. A guy called Liam Mellows, who you may have heard of before, turns out with 350 or so men around Athenry, and they occupy a castle there in Athenry, but nothing really happens. And after a few days, they disperse, and there's no major engagement or no fighting of any kind really with Mellows and his men. But again, as I said, the British aren't sure, is this rising going to kick off in other places? So they have to try and patrol the area for a number of reasons. One, to arrest any rebels or Sinn Féiners that they come across, or Sinn Féiners as they call them. Of course, Sinn Féin wasn't really the people who started the rising. This was a name given to the rebels by the British because they didn't really know who had caused or organized the rising. So they're sent off to arrest dangerous Sinn Féiners, to collect arms and to pacify the country. So basically it's a show of strength. It's the British Army getting themselves out there in the country, showing the locals, look, everything's under control, nothing to see here, we are still in charge. But the area that they have to control is a huge area, so stretching all the way from Kildare down towards Roscrea and Nina, across the Ballina, Killaloe, and up through North Clare and into Tuam and up as far almost as Castlebar. So it's a massive area for them to try and patrol, and they are part of a larger unit that are doing that, and they move around there for a couple of days after the Easter Rising, and eventually, of course, make their way down to Killaloe. And that, of course, is how John Charlesworth ends up rolling into Killaloe as part of the 2nd 8th Battalion on the 16th of May 1916. Okay, so it's a Tuesday morning. This is an old map of the town. You might see some things here that you're quite familiar with, including the Lakeside Hotel. The soldiers are billeted here in the Lakeside Hotel on the Ballina side of the river, of course. And the river is quite swollen at the time. There has been heavy rain in the previous few days, and the river is quite heavy, quite strong. And the commanding officer, Colonel Oates, later writes that several boats were moored to the bank, and they ordered the men not to meddle with them. But of course, 3 men disobeyed the order and entered the boats. Okay, those 3 men, of course, were John Charlesworth and 2 of his buddies, a guy called Private Simpkin and a guy called Private Tully. So between the coroner's report, which we have, was reported in the Nina Guardian at the time, and also the military inquiry, we have a fairly good idea of what happened next. So just going to read you, so we've witness statements from the 2 guys who survived, the 2 of the 3 who got into the boats, Tully and Simpkin. So I'm just going to read their witness testimony, if you just bear with me for a second. So evidence given by Tully states that on Tuesday, the 16th of May, after entering billets at the Lakeside Hotel, I entered a boat at the landing stage there with Private Charlesworth and Private Simpkin. Private Simpkin had removed a board from the bottom of the boat, and we were rowing backwards and forwards with it close to the shore. The boat got a little below the landing stage and further out, and we could not get back to the shore. Private Charlesworth and I removed 2 more pieces of wood from the bottom of the boat and made further efforts to get the boat back to land. The boards were footboards used for rowing. Efforts were made continuously to get the boat to shore, but it was carried with increasing rapidity down the stream towards the weir. The boat turned round and round and ultimately crashed into the weir, the gates of which were partially closed. The force of the current broke the boat, which was drawn down under the gates. I clung to the iron step on the side of the stone pillar and was assisted in climbing up to the top of the weir by a signaller. Private Charlesworth was carried under the gates, and before I was rescued, I saw him being carried downstream. He had a piece of board under his arm to which he was clinging. I saw him go 150 yards, after which I lost sight of him. I never saw him again. Private Simpkin clung to the weir for perhaps 3 minutes, after which he was carried away by the force of the current. Okay, so that's Tully's statement as to what happened. Private Simpkin then says, I got into the boat with Private Charlesworth and Tully. We rowed about with pieces of wood we took from the bottom of the boat. Ultimately, we got some way from the landing stage and were carried away by the current. The boat hit the weir broadside and was broken and sucked down. Private Tully jumped onto the framework of the weir, and I clung to one of the girders supporting the lock gate. I never saw Private Charlesworth again. I was up to the knees in the water, and the current was so strong I could not hold on to the girder more than 5 minutes, after which I had to let go and was carried under the gates. I swam as far as I could and afterwards lost consciousness. When I first got into the boat, it was tied up to a stake, and I don't know who undid it. So basically what's happened is the guys have got into a boat here beside the lakeside. There was no oars in the boat at the time, so they were using boards that they pulled up from the bottom of the boat as oars to try and steer and control the thing. But of course, they got too far from the shore and the current takes them downstream. Now, the weir that they're referring to, you can see it on the map here, was a series of sluice gates that were on the river at the time. They're no longer there. They have been removed. I'll show you a picture of it here, actually. A nice picture of the sluice gates there with the Lakeside Hotel in the background. So these gates were used basically to control the flow of the river. And they were removed, as I said, around the late 1920s when the Shannon scheme was being built. Those sluice gates would have been removed. You can actually see, if you look across the river from the Killaloe side, that lovely new house that's been built there along the shore or the banks of the river. There's a kind of a concrete abutment, I think is the only way I could describe it. It's actually the remnants of these sluice gates. So that's still there, and you can still see that if you take a wander down around there. But this is what they crashed into, and that's what broke up the boat. So Private Tully manages to hang on to one of these girders or gates here. The boat is swept under, and Charlesworth and Simpkin are carried down the stream. So just going to show you the map now with the modern satellite view overlaid on it there. So up here in the top left, we have the lakeside. Here's where they would have got into the boat. Here is, or was, the sluice gates that they crashed into. And Charlesworth and Simpkin then start floating down the river here, carried down by the current. Now, on the bank at the time, another soldier sees what's happening, a guy called Private Martin, and he jumps into the river to try and rescue Simpkin. Unfortunately, he also gets into trouble. He's unable to rescue Simpkin. So you now have 4 guys in the water, one clinging onto the sluice gates here, Simpkin and Martin, who jumped in to rescue him, floating down the river here, and John Charlesworth, who has completely disappeared from sight, and nobody has seen him. Now, somewhere below the bridge then, they go under the bridge, and somewhere down here we have a group of local fishermen who are in a boat, and they managed to pick up Martin and Simpkin. They barely get a mention, which is interesting in the military inquiry, but the coroner in his report does mention them by name and commends them for their actions. He gives the names as Michael Barry, Peter Noonan, Thomas Maloney, William Malone, Michael Keeshan, and William Lucas. So interesting to know if there was any family connections to people still living in the local area to those guys. So they're all mentioned as helping out. So the 2 guys are lifted out of the water. They're unconscious getting out, but they are revived, and they're fine. They live to tell the tale. John, unfortunately, is gone. He's disappeared. There's no sign of him. And his body is only recovered 7 days later, about 1.5 miles downstream by 2 fishermen. Their names are also given, William Ives and Thomas Warren. So they're fishing down in Moys, which is at the back of Claresford Park there, where the water meets the park. That's where John's body is found 7 days later. And on his body is found his personal effects, a disc around his neck with the name J. Charlesworth, C of E for Church of England, 8 N and D, which stands for the 8th Battalion of the Notts and Derby, his army paybook, rosary beads, belt, postcards, letters, photos, and 3 shillings, 1.5 pence. Okay, so the news is reported in local newspapers and local media, of course, but it also reaches his hometown of Mansfield. And we have a report here from the Mansfield Reporter about the death of John. Brief details published in last Friday's Reporter of the tragic death of Private John Charlesworth of C Company 28 Sherwood Foresters, whose mother resides at 5 Broomhill, Mansfield. The poor lad, it appears, was in a boat on the River Shannon, etc., etc. And they go on to explain the story in detail. And unfortunately for John, his battalion have left Killaloe before his body is found. So none of his mates are around to see him be buried. And the army asks the Royal Irish Constabulary basically to take over the funeral and to arrange the funeral for him. And we also have a report of that in which reaches the Mansfield newspapers as well. So the body of Private John Charlesworth of Mansfield, who was drowned in the Shannon at Killaloe, full particulars appearing in last week's Reporter, has been recovered about 1.5 miles downstream from the scene of the occurrence. An inquest was held, and on the same evening, May the 31st, the remains of the poor lad were laid to rest in Killaloe churchyard. In the unavoidable absence of the military, members of the Royal Irish Constabulary attended, and there was a large attendance of the public. So the RIC, as we said, look after the funeral, and the army covered the expenses. The funeral costs are £3.15. And it's nice to see, I think, that there was a show of public there, that the public came out to see him. And I think we have to remember at the time, looking back at it now, people would say, oh, this was the enemy, we were fighting against the British at the time. In 1916, that wasn't actually the case. Many Irishmen, around 200,000 Irishmen, would have been fighting on the same side as the Sherwood Foresters and as John Charlesworth. My own great-grandfather included, who fought in the First World War. So the Irish at this time had not really turned against the British to the extent that they would later on in 1916. It's only after the Easter Rising and the execution of the rebels that public sympathy turns towards the rebels and against the British. So at this time, there would still have been a lot of public sympathy for a British soldier who died on Irish soil. And as I said, his mates weren't there to see him. His family weren't there for the funeral. So it was nice that there was some bit of a show from the public and from the RIC for a young boy who was a long way from home with no family there, and who you have to remember at this stage was only 17 years and 4 months old. So still not even old enough to join the army, yet here he is dead in Killaloe while serving his country and serving the army. So that's pretty much it. One last thing I might want to mention actually is the photograph of John Charlesworth. Myself and Arlene and Deborah have been discussing this for quite a while. When I first wrote the article, this photo didn't actually exist. And then I went down to have a look at the grave. I think it was maybe last year or a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years. And all of a sudden this photograph had appeared, a tiny little miniature of John attached to the gravestone. So we have no idea where this photograph came from. We assume some relative had come over, tracked it down his grave and put the picture of him there. But we really don't know who left it there. And we would be very grateful to find out who left it there, or if anyone can shed any light on that mystery, we'd be very grateful to find out. And to get in touch with those people. So that's it, folks. I hope you found that interesting and informative. And if you do have any questions or anything you want me to clarify, I'll do my best to answer.
Thank you, Darren. That was really, really good. You've done some amount of research.
Yes.
We didn't expect all that background. It's very, very interesting.
There you go.
So if people would like to ask questions, as Arlene pointed out, if you have your camera off, we are recording this. So if you want to not appear in the video that we'll put on YouTube, you can leave your camera off. But if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask a question, that would be great.
I'll do my best to answer. I'm not sure if I can.
I had one thing to comment on, Darren. He died the day he arrived in Killaloe, did he?
Yeah, that same day.
Wow.
Yeah, so they arrived on the Tuesday morning, and he was dead by that afternoon. Yeah.
Wow.
So he wasn't in Killaloe for very long at all.
No. Poor fella at that age, 17 and 4 months old.
Yeah, so like when I first looked at the story, all the reports and all the army records and the Commonwealth Graves Commission still have him as a 20-year-old when he died. And it was only after researching the census, of course, and eventually finding his birth cert that I found out the true age. So yeah, 17 years and 4 months. So, still a very, very young boy and still not even legally allowed to become a soldier,
Soldier. I must look at the Teenage Tommies on YouTube. It sounds great.
Yeah, it's a very good show. Some really sad stories in it, and that one about Horace Isles, I think the one I told earlier on, is particularly tragic, I think.
Yeah. Gosh, we have, let me see, have we some questions here? Johnny Doyle says, very good. Frederick Dietrichson, married in Dublin and possibly one of the only members of the
2/7, who might have known something about the area. Lieutenant Nealon killed on the first day of the rising with Tommy Field, 2 men John Fermoy in 1916. Okay, and the last soldier of war drowned in Bunratty. Yeah, there's a grave of a World War I soldier in Bunratty. I think that Ger Brown actually mentioned him when he did his talk on the Great War. But that's true about Frederick Dietrichson. But also one of the sources for a lot of the information I got was the Lieutenant Colonel Oates, who wrote a history of the 2nd Battalion, or the 2nd 8th Sherwood Foresters. He actually was a former member of the Munster Fusiliers, so he had spent a bit of time in Ireland as well. So he would have known a bit about Dublin and the area, yeah.
So he was, what was the names of the men that rescued the 3 lads?
I have them here again. They were fishing at the time. Michael Barry, Peter Noonan, Thomas Maloney, William Malone, Michael Keeshan and William Lucas. So
They're very Lucas anyway, and Barry would be local now.
Yeah, there is possibly relations or descendants of those guys still knocking around. Yeah.
Tommy Malone and Billy Malone would have both served in the First World War, as far as I know. They were up at the crossroads.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah, there's possibly some relationship there.
You know, Lizzie Lewis's father, I remember him, and and Billy would be Pauline's grandfather.
All right.
Yeah, and Lucas and Noonan, I'm sure the Noonans, Peter Noonan.
Yeah, and Lucas would have been
Grimes's.
Yes, Josie Grimes's. Yeah. Okay.
This is where being a blow-in has its disadvantages, because you don't have all these little family connections,
Yeah.
But we had Lewis's oral history, don't we, Arlene? I wonder, did she mention anything in that? I don't remember.
I don't think so. No, I must look through some of the oral histories again and see is there anything.
She's mentioned, yeah.
Yeah.
So, has anyone else got a question there for Darren?
Mighty Darren, this is your rich uncle here. Very proud of you.
Thanks, Dahi.
If that doesn't inspire young people into further research and loving history, nothing will. So thanks.
Exactly.
Thank you very much.
Well said, Dahi. Well said.
Yeah.
It was very interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Really found that study. Really was a Catholic, or was it issued from the army or what?
Sorry, say again?
You said there was a rosary beads found on his body.
Yeah, he was actually Church of England though, so not sure what the rosary beads thing was.
Used them, you see.
There was actually a notice was sent home to his home in Manfield asking the family whether they wanted a Protestant or a Catholic burial. So that's why he's buried, obviously, in the graveyard below, which would have been Protestant graveyard. But yeah, that's an interesting point as well. Yeah.
Maybe they went to war laden with anything they could have, anything to protect them.
Exactly, yeah. A lot of it would have been superstition probably as well, so yeah.
That was so shocking about Northumberland Avenue, was it? The
Northumberland Road, yeah.
They were prepared for trench warfare, like they were really just thrown there.
Yeah, and again, I think it shows the callousness really of the system at the time, where you had this, this imperial system that just rounded up these young boys and basically sent them off to slaughter. It was horrendous what was happening on the front, but yeah, they were really raw recruits just sent in.
And perhaps the British didn't think that the rebels were going to do the damage they did. Obviously, at 100-to-1 ratio, they thought they'd be fine; they'd be able to overcome them.
Yeah, and I think maybe the welcome that they received as they came into Dunleary gave them a bit of false sense of security. Maybe they were quite warmly welcomed, and then everything turned bad once they reached Northumberland Road.
Wow.
But yeah, you're literally talking about a handful of rebels, and I mean, you should, any well-trained army would easily have been able to take them over. But the fact that they were so raw and badly led as well, I suppose that's always a theme in the First World War, is how badly these soldiers were led by their superiors. And I think that was shown as well in at Mount Street, how a handful of rebels managed to inflict that amount of damage on the British,
Yeah. Oh, we've a lady saying her great-grandfather was in the Sherwood Foresters, but in the 10th Battalion, so he was in France.
Brilliant. That's amazing. Yeah, so the 2-8, still kind of delving into their history, but they hung around Ireland for a few months afterwards, They trained up in the Curragh for a while, and I think in February of 2017, then they were sent over to France. So I must continue the story there and see what happened to them over there. It would be interesting to find out what happened to the two boys who got into the boat, whether they actually came back alive or not. So
they always remember.
That'll be my next project.
Yeah. Gosh, and to think they had to leave, like they had to go with their battalion, they had to leave and not see their colleagues buried or anything.
I got the impression from the sources as well that they didn't really look that hard for John's body afterwards. I think they pretty much packed up and left the following day. So that's kind of disappointing as well, I guess, if you're...
So they weren't staying in Killaloe for long. If they just arrived on the Tuesday and they kind of left on the Wednesday then?
Yeah, there's a report about them arriving in Nina as well and kind of doing the rounds there. But they didn't really meet any opposition anywhere. Like if you fast forward 4 years to maybe 1920 or 21, then there would have been a lot more opposition to them. But 1916, this, you know, you're talking about a minority of people who started in 1916 rising at that stage. And most Irish men, as I said, at that stage were still kind of on the side of the British or fighting, or had brothers or sons or fathers or whatever who were fighting in the war. So that hostility to the British wasn't really there at that stage. It was only later on that it kind of turned against them, you know.
There's an interesting point. Did a local stonemason do the gravestone? I've never looked at who carved it. Did you?
Not sure about that one, no. But I know there was a marble factory in Killaloe for a while. I'm not sure, was that still open at that stage? I don't know.
No, but there were people that made headstones around here. I think chapel.
It is, as I said, it's an unusual graveyard. It kind of stands out. It's different color. It's a little bit whiter and cleaner looking than some of the other ones. So it kind of something that you'd notice, you know, if you went in there.
And the other thing is, we don't know who puts the poppy on it every year for Remembrance Day.
Yes,
like it's fascinating. It's kind of
there's a mysterious person going around paying tribute to John.
No one knows on this talk. No, who's
no.
No.
Nobody wants to reveal themselves. Yeah, so that is a mystery, and it would be really interesting to find out who put the picture there. And
do you ever come across that picture in your searches anywhere else?
Never,
no. So it wasn't in public domain. So
it must be a family thing. That's why I'm thinking it had to be relations, you know.
Dean Owen's wife, and when I was young, used to sell the poppies around the street, around the shops, and that, you know, Dean Owen, that was Church of Ireland minister. She used to sell them when not that young, but, and also Niles were grave or monumental sculptures, weren't the Niles?
Yes.
And isn't there a grave headstone done by Pádraig Pearse's father below?
Oh, I don't know that, Frida.
It's just as you go in, you can see it.
Okay.
Before Francis Condon at this side, at the side where the oratory is.
All right, yeah, it's the Celtic Cross one. I've taken a photo of one of it.
I'm not sure, but the name is on it, Pearse. I think it's Pádraig Pearse's father.
Okay.
Oh, wow. Yeah, he was a mason, I think, or was it
I don't know what, but I think, and as I say, Niles up on the hill road there where Tony Harden's house was. I think they were, what do you call them?
They were stonemasons, yeah. And was he the man that was on Chapel Street? I thought he was a
Q.
There was McHugh's as well, wasn't there?
Yeah, but that was in my time.
Oh, right, okay, a bit later.
Not right, Michael, it is, isn't it? Maureen Kyo's dead. Yeah, he was back at the church. Yeah. Okay, I better go away. I've sheep to feed.
Oh, yeah. Okay, Frida, we must call and see you now that we're allowed.
Thank you.
There's another comment there, Deborah, in the chat there, an interesting one.
The RFIU president.
Yeah, Frank Browning killed on Northumberland Road, having been shot on the first day of the rising.
That's the Irish Rugby Federation, is it?
IRFU?
Yeah. Irish Rugby Football Union, yeah.
So he was killed in that battle. I wonder was he an accidental? Is Johnny Doyle there? Was he an accidental? Was he just a victim, or was he actually on one side or the other? No, he's not there.
He was a member of the Volunteer Training Corps.
Okay. All right.
You might hear of them as the Gorgeous Rex. They were shot up on the Monday, so he was one of the casualties. So, although the Sherwoods arrived on the Wednesday, they had been fighting on the Monday.
Okay.
And the Gorgeous Rex were based out of Beggar's Bush, Johnny? Is that
right? Yeah.
Yes, Johnny, you know your stuff as well. Huh?
Sorry, that was me.
So, any other questions or comments? No, are we done?
I think so. Yeah. There's great feedback there. Incredible research. Incredible lecture. Great feedback coming in there.
It was.
Thanks.
Super. And we have a recording, and we'll put the recording on YouTube.
Very good.
And because everyone did hit their cameras, or that wanted to, or that didn't, now we don't have to edit like we have had to edit all the other ones. So which took some time. So we should get this one up fairly quick.
Good stuff.
And thank you, Darren. And we'll have
Thank you
back.
again for the invitation, and yeah, it's good to share the story.
You'll come back to us now, won't you? You'll just
Well, I have to find something else to write about now, but if I do, I'll be back. Yeah.
Well, you've William Henry Spice now.
Yeah, I'm working on him, so we'll see what comes of that.
That's great.
Thanks, Darren.
Great stuff. Thanks a million, guys.
Thank you.
Take care.
So
Thanks very much.
will we, in June. When are we going to have it, Arlene?
Our next talk, is it in June?
Yeah. In
Our
on the
next,
23rd. The second last Wednesday, yeah? Is that what we do?
the third, yeah, the 23rd, I think, wasn't it? 23rd of June.
And I'll be doing that talk on Dr. Julio Burke, who lived on Abbey Street, and he was poisoned in Ballina in 1915. And I've researched his past and his relatives and his Killaloe heritage. So I know quite a lot more about him other than how he died. And I've been in touch with his great-grandniece and great-grandnephew, sorry. So I have some family lore to tell you. So I really loved researching Dr. Julio. So I'm looking forward to doing that. And yeah, so we said we have to fill in sometimes. We can't be always asking other people to talk for us. No.
Are you just typing? There's a query there. Is there an email address for Darren to follow up?
Just giving it
You're
to him
typing
there.
back. That's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay.
No problem. Yeah.
Yeah.
And if
Great.
anyone has any queries, you can get in touch with the local history society anyway, and we can forward it on to Darren.
Brilliant.
Lovely.
Okay.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Darren.
guys.
Thanks a million, Darren.
Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Now stop recording.